Hi, welcome to the Inflectra webinar on development and testing challenges in the financial services industry. My name is Adam Sandman, and in today's webinar, we're going to first talk about the challenges in the banking and finance industries. We're going to then look at two specific case studies or horror stories from the news. We'll then look at the Inflectra platform and how it provides testing and compliance tools to reduce risk on your projects. Specifically, how you can manage testing and compliance with SpiraTeam, and then how you can go one step further and automate your testing with our Rapise test automation tool. So first of all, the challenges in the banking and finance industry. So there's lots of things going on in the industry over the past 10 to 15 years. Obviously, the most newsworthy is the compliance with regulations. There's been a large number of new regulations since the financial crisis to try and reduce risk, systemic risk anyway. Things like Sarbanes-Oxley, the Dodd-Frank Act, also the FATCA for foreign compliance of transactions, prevent money laundering. Every time these regulations get passed, unfortunately, in the finance industry, you have to understand what that means for your systems and make sure that when you do testing and development, when you roll out new features and new functions, online banking applications or new wire transfer functionality, you have to make sure that you're always compliant with this ever-expanding set of regulations. And these three are just the US regulations. In Europe, there's additional banking regulations, and with Brexit coming, there may be a splintering of regulations across Europe as well. So in addition to that, systemic compliance aspect, there's also innovation that's being foisted on the industry as well. Things like the rise of cryptocurrencies, alternative currencies, and use of blockchain-based contracts. So that's changing the role of how banking and contracts are going to work in the future. There are some cities like in Switzerland, I think Zug, that are building an entire industry on cryptocurrencies. And even though it's not necessarily clear where that's going to shake out, it is fostering innovation in the financial service sector, which requires new computer systems to handle these new currencies and new technologies and new transactions. In addition to that, the rise of artificial intelligence and high-frequency trading on the capital market side, it's also changing technology. If the trading is going to be done at high frequency by semi-artificial intelligent bots and agents that have potentially machine learning-based components, the trading platforms themselves have to be able to work at ever higher volumes, be able to spot patterns that could cause crash flashes, or when you have lots of trading technologies all working in tandem, magnifying the risks in the system. So those technology innovations are also, I think, driving a lot of innovation and a huge amount of system development and testing, load testing, security testing, at the very least, on the financial service industry and the tools and technologies that underpin the industry. In addition to that, on some of our horror stories, we'll talk about these. Unfortunately, the financial crisis also resulted in a lot of banks and banking players getting rather quickly merged together and resulting in a lot of very big glued together institutions which have a lot of computer systems from their legacy parts that have been put together quickly without necessary thought for how they get maintained and upgraded. And then, of course, as you try and move from those glued together legacy platforms to newer platforms that hopefully will foster the innovation we just talked about, someone's got to make sure that that data is successfully migrated, the new systems have sufficient capacity, and you still maintain the compliance with all the regulations that the old system was able to maintain, and that you haven't lost any functionality or lost any of the required functionality by law in that migration. Okay, so that's a lot already. But then you also have things around cybersecurity and data breaches. And this is not a presentation specifically on cybersecurity, so we're not going to dwell on that significantly in of itself. But in general, you have to have processes and policies and just testing in place, test management and test processes and test plans in place to make sure that your systems are going to be secure from a cybersecurity perspective. The penalty for data breaches will have increased massively under the European General Data Protection Regulation, both the penalties that will be levied and also the types of breach that require such protection. And so I think the scope of privacy and also the news around Facebook and other non-banking systems has, I think, raised the public's perception of the risk in the system. And of course, there's been breaches like Equifax and also other similar institutions that manage credit scores, credit numbers in the past few years. So that's some of the challenges. In addition, the customers are expecting increased functionality. They're expecting better user experiences, faster user experiences. They're expecting mobile banking, mobile payments, particularly the reduction in cost of banks has meant that many branches are going away. So if you're living in a rural area, your only ability to get in touch with your bank maybe through a mobile phone or a web browser. And because of that reduction in the branch structure and the call center staff, that's putting the burden on these systems to an even greater degree. So you have to have banking systems that have more functionality, that replace what the branches were doing. It has to be more convenient, it has to be effective, but it also has to support an increasing number of users who may be moving worldwide and expect to be able to bank anywhere and everywhere, any device, any platform, any service. So those are some of the challenges and I guess opportunities in the financial industry. And obviously, when things go wrong, which unfortunately they do sometimes, there are some cases that have hit the headlines recently. So I thought I'd put these in here just to give you a flavor of when things go wrong, what the impact and the ROI on the cost can be. So there are two, and unfortunately they're both from Britain, my home country. Not to pick on them, it's just the ones that are in the news headlines most recently. So the Royal Bank of Scotland had a set of different systems that it basically had inherited from its original bank, plus in the financial crisis, NatWest and Ulster Bank were merged together quickly, and they were going to upgrade their payment system, CA7 software in fact, and they did it over a weekend, and the result was that for 2 weeks, people and businesses, and the latter have in many cases the greater need here, were unable to make any payments or access cash from ATMs. So suddenly businesses couldn't make payroll, they couldn't pay their staff, they couldn't pay their vendors, people who had weddings, people on travel. There were stories of commuters who couldn't get to work because they couldn't pay their monthly season ticket. In addition to not being able to access the system, which is bad enough, there was also bad data. And that's a more dangerous issue, because that results in potentially fraud and potentially payments being made to multiple people then using that to then excuse to extort money from other people, and obviously people cyber scamming confused consumers. So there was a huge amount of confusion, not just about not being able to use the systems, but also, was the data in the system? Were the transactions, were they credible? Were they actually meeting the requirements of the banking system? Did you have duplicate payments? So as a result, there was a business impact. Firstly, on a pure monetary form, the Bank of England did fine the Royal Bank of Scotland 56 million, and the Financial Certification Authority also levied their own fines. I don't have the number for that, but obviously the reputational impact is even bigger. So they lost customers, businesses would switch, and in fact, they had to retain customers, had to make potentially interest rate improvements to their savings accounts. They had to sweeten the accounts they did offer to customers to try and keep them, and there's a cost to that. So that's probably at least $20-30 million equivalent of incentives they had to provide just to retain their current customers. And of course, if that wasn't bad enough, it happened 2 years later. So the first issue was in 2012. 2015, the whole thing happened again with the payment system on a second upgrade. Payments went missing. Why did it happen, though? I mean, because obviously it hits the headlines and people are concerned about the stories you'll hear about, a wedding reception that couldn't get paid for, things like that. But from a systems perspective, why did it happen? And the problem is, and this is not just in finance, aviation has some of the same limitations. Delta had a breakdown a few years ago. A lot of these systems are all mainframe systems. They were put together a long time ago, and they work. They're very reliable. They've been tested. There's a large body of testing, compliance. They're very trusted and they're robust. But unfortunately, as the different banks got merged together, you've got a hodgepodge of these different systems. They are individually reliable, but they are archaic. The people who know how they work are dying off. The technologies they're written in, for example, COBOL, are not well understood anymore, and people don't practice that technology. And so, as these banks get merged together and they have to support all these new technologies in online banking, computers have to basically move to newer platforms. But how do you do that and yet support the load that these old systems were supporting? And so the problem is that banks are stuck with a rock in a hard place. They can keep their old systems, which are rock solid individually, but they can't integrate them, they can't advance them, or they have to move to a new platform. And when that happens, the consequences can be catastrophic. And that's highlighted, in fact, in the second horror story we have, which is an even more recent one. It happened about a month and a half ago, and I believe it is still actually affecting users and customers today. And this is where a bank, the Lloyds Banking Group in London, had originally acquired a bank called the TSB Bank during the financial crisis, but as part of the settlement, they had to spin it off. And so TSB were using a cloned version of the Lloyds' old, glued together mainframe infrastructure. And when they were bought by a Spanish bank, the Spanish bank decided they were going to move them to a new platform. And this new platform is a modern digital multi-tier web-based architecture, could handle mobile banking. And they'd already proven this migration on a smaller scale with other banks they'd already acquired. So it seemed like a good idea, right? We're going to move from a hodgepodge of old legacy systems to a modern banking platform that we've already used on multiple acquisitions prior to that. This should be a good thing. However, what wasn't apparent to the people planning this was that the previous migrations were for very small regional banks. They were going to move the fifth biggest bank in the UK onto the same platform. It was, I think, 100 times bigger than the scale of anything they had done before on this platform. And the people doing the migration, both from a design and planning and requirements management and test planning, hadn't anticipated that factor of 100 would make the difference between success and failure. And what happened, if you read the news, you can see the stories. There were two main issues. One in some ways more serious. The first was actually the capacity issue, which is still affecting people today. People just can't access the system. So first of all, consumers and businesses couldn't access the web or mobile systems. So no one could make payments, no one could see their accounts, no one could do any kind of banking online. Unfortunately, those same systems are being used by the branches. So if someone went to the branch to try and do it the old-fashioned way, to make payments for payroll, for example, the branch themselves couldn't. So you had all these branch staff sitting in front of computers, completely impotent, unable to do anything to help people. So they were frustrated too. So the entire bank was brought to its knees, as its CEO said, because they didn't have a separate system for the banking staff, and they hadn't planned for this. Maybe if they planned to cut off all online banking, but instead retained access to the branches, maybe they would have had enough capacity, and they could have used people to fill the gap. But because they hadn't planned for this, they had no idea how bad it was. Everything was down all at once. The second and more serious issue, actually, at the beginning, was that you could actually see other people's accounts. So there was a data integrity issue. People were actually able to see other people's accounts and apparently could even make transfers. So some people, saw a mortgage account, would pay into it from someone else's account. And then now you've got reputational issues about the data and then is this data even reliable? So even if we get the systems back up, can we rely on that data? Are those transactions valid? Is fraud is going on? If someone logged in and potentially moved money, how do we know? Is that a real transfer? Was it not? So huge issues from a data integrity standpoint. The business implications are they're going to be most likely paying at least $30 million in incentives to retain people. The fines are going to be $70 million or more. And the original plan was to save £100 million, £1 million a year, primarily by getting off the old platform that Lloyd's was managing. Potentially this is going to swamp that. It's at least $100 million in the first year in penalties and incentives. It may well get higher than that. And of course, it did happen before May 25th. Had this happened after May 25th, the European Union would have probably got involved and the fines would have been significantly higher, at the very least because of the data integrity issues. People's personal banking information shared with other users would violate GDPR. Huge issues. So that's another set of implications. And how did this one happen? Well, basically, it clearly was down to, in this case, a failure of test planning. There are different experts who have looked at this. Obviously, the details exactly of what happened aren't public and may never be public. But they had done some testing before with their, I think, smaller branches. So that gave them a false confidence in what they were doing. And so what they did is they assumed it was a replication of a previous infrastructure migration that had worked. So instead of planning it from scratch, understanding all the systems, understanding that on the Sunday night when they moved everything over, having a robust test plan and then having tested something of the same scale, they were complacent. They assumed that their previous results were indicative of future, and so they didn't have any plan for testing it at the scale that it was going to be migrated on. And the other thing is they didn't have a robust plan for falling back, because if on Sunday night they had a good set of load tests available, and they suddenly realized that this system was not ready, they could have on Sunday night rolled back to Lloyd's and their old system for another month and continued operating without the transactional data integrity. But once they went live with this to the public, all the new transactions are in the new system, then they lost their rollback option to go back to their old infrastructure. So it was a combination of, I think, bad planning and also just not a well-executed test strategy. So these are two horror stories that we hope never happen to anyone else. We'll see. So in terms of how do you avoid this? Well, some of this stuff is culture. Some of this stuff is also a policy from a management standpoint. If management don't understand the risks involved and don't want to plan or assume that it's going to be easy because they've done it before, tools won't solve that problem. So there's a culture and there's a management and processes that you have to have. However, we do believe that the tools do have a role to play, and if you have the right tools with the right culture and you have the right processes, you are more likely to be successful when you build new systems, roll out new systems, migrate systems, or test upgrades to systems. And so the Inflectra suite we're going to be talking about consists of several products, and in today's webinar we're going to be looking specifically at SpiraTeam, which is our application lifecycle management solution, and Rapise, which is our test automation solution. And so first of all, on the SpiraTeam side, one of the things that you need to understand is your requirements. And so if you're building an application or upgrading an application, migrating data, there ultimately are requirements for that effort, and some of them may be explicit. For example, we have to move from platform A to platform B, we have to add mobile banking, we have to add wire transfers to our mobile banking application. Whatever those requirements are, there's a whole bunch of explicit ones. There's also a whole bunch of implicit and implied requirements. We must have capacity for 100,000 users simultaneously. We must make sure all transactions get copied across. We must make sure users can only access the appropriate accounts. Some of those may be implied because maybe they're in the old system, but the new system doesn't have those as explicit requirements. So an important thing to think about would be making sure that you do have sufficient requirements that cover not just what you think you need to do, but also everything that the old system did. Those are implied requirements. They have to be met. And then once you've done that, you have to make sure that those requirements can link to other things. So just go back 1 second. You'll notice here we have a test coverage column. It's important once you've written your requirements that you have a plan for testing them. Because if you have a requirement and there's no way of testing it, all you have is a dream or an idea. It's not a real requirement. And so an important thing is taking all those requirements, the ones for the explicit for the new system, plus all of the things that it has to do that the old one did, those all need to have a robust set of tests to go with them. And that's important to be able to look at. Okay, if we have this requirement, we need to prove that we have a test that covers it. We also need to understand, does that requirement have any other requirements that it connects to? So for example, if the requirement is that you have to be able to have simultaneously 100,000 logins accessing the system, there may be a use case or another requirement that's connected to that around the load. And maybe you have to have a requirement that it's accessible within 4 seconds, because otherwise the 100,000 people accessing the system, well, without specifying another requirement that's the response time, it's kind of meaningless. It could take an hour for everyone to use the system. Also, when you're talking about requirements traceability, it's really important that you have the traceability not just from the requirements to the test cases, but also to things like the defects. So let's say they were doing some initial testing of that banking migration, and we found an issue that came up. If you tied that back to the requirement, and you suddenly saw a whole bunch of defects from the dev team and the test team that all tie back to one requirement, and that requirement is critical, for example, supporting 100,000 users, maybe it's important that you delay the release, because that's a really important thing to know. So it's important to know not just the requirements, it's also important to know what connects them. Other things you can do is, in many tools now, you can actually connect your source code, and in SpiraTeam no different. You can connect your source code to your system, so that if developers are making 1,000 check-ins the night before you go live, probably that's a bad thing. That means your system is really unstable, the team is in a panic mode, and as a manager, you have to go in and see if you're making that many commits and you're changing all these requirements at the last minute. The team may think the system is going to go live successfully. As a manager, you probably realize the risk is too high. So if you were the manager at TSB and you were there on the phone looking with your development team on the conference call, and you were looking in SpiraTeam and you saw thousands of commits, thousands of changes to the system on that weekend before you go live, you'd probably want to say, hey guys, maybe we should delay. So the right tools can basically make a big difference to giving management the data to make the right decisions. It doesn't necessarily mean the management will make the right decisions, but if they have at least the tools to give them the data, they can hopefully make a credible decision. So another thing that people often don't think about is requirements don't just live in the system. Requirements are beyond the system. So for example, if you were building a system in banking and you're in the US, you have to comply with FATCA, Sarbanes-Oxley, potentially depending on the size of your institution, and other privacy regulations. There's a whole bunch of banking rules. those are requirements. And so one of the things you can do in SpiraTeam and some other tools is you can actually build out those as projects with all the requirements as a core set of requirements, because everything you build in your bank is going to have to comply with these. So why have 1,000 projects with 1,000 duplicate sets of policies? And so what we recommend to our clients is create a project with all the policies, all the legal requirements, everything that doesn't change because you are a bank of this size and you have these rules you have to follow, and then every system that you build has its own set of requirements, but then you share the requirements from your policy projects into your individual projects. Now you can guarantee that every project is compliant. Whereas if you have to maintain those requirements in every single project, imagine you made a mistake, you forgot to include some of them because you forgot to copy them, or maybe there's a new banking regulation that comes out. You have to go to every project and add those new requirements because there's been a change in the law. That's really hard to maintain. It's hard to prove you've got the compliance, hard to make sure you haven't missed something. By having a centralized set of policies that the other requirements can derive from, it guarantees you're compliant. You can prove to your auditors and your regulators that you know what you're doing and you've got a valid and solid test plan. So that's great. Now the other thing is audit and logging. That's a really important part of any system. In SpiraTeam, if you're building a system, we do have a robust audit trail across the entire system. So that includes in the requirements management module, the test cases, test steps, the releases, the defects. If you change anything, there is a permanent trail and you can go in and check that. And that's an important thing because let's say that some of the requirements changed, but then no one changed the test cases, or maybe the test failed, and instead of fixing the issue, someone went in there and said, well, you know what, we can make this work, we'll change the test case. So there are two ways to make a test pass. You can change the test, or you can fix the issue. They both will make it pass, but one is a big problem. And so having an audit trail is really important because if, for example, you have a development team that maybe you're not comfortable with, maybe they're outsourced, maybe they made some changes to get the thing to pass, ultimately you as the owner of the bank or the IT group of the bank, you're on the hook for this. If this thing goes wrong, if you're at TSB or Royal Bank of Scotland right now, you can't blame those developers or vendors, or if you do, it's not going to help you. Ultimately, you're responsible and accountable to the public and to the regulators. So you're going to be the ones who have to basically go in there and deal with this situation. So if you go in the audit trail and you see it's been tampered with, you can get an early indication that perhaps all the greens on your test case system, all the requirements that are showing green, maybe that's not true. So audit trail is really important. And also, unfortunately, if things do go badly and there is an investigation and you can prove to the regulators that you did the right thing, that probably would reduce the fines and all the issues that some of these banks get into. I mean, it may not repair the reputational impact, but from a legal standpoint, if you've got a solid audit trail, even with the best will in the world, potentially some of these issues will still happen. If you at least followed all the processes, you had a good test plan, you tried everything. If it was just a freak accident and something happened, having the audit trail and the reporting to show will make a difference that you can actually at least prove to the regulators that you did the right thing. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, we also did talk about, if you remember in the earlier part of the presentation, about the agility and about innovation. So one of the things that people are doing increasingly is adopting Agile, which is great. We want to have systems faster. We want to be able to get like a mobile banking out to our users in a more responsive way. So people are expecting, updates to their banking apps faster and faster. Also, when there are security breaches or issues, cyber issues, banks do need to push out updates faster because if there's a breakdown in a cyber cipher, if a security researcher has found something and they've reported it, you need to get those fixes out. So the fact that we have compliance requirements and you have all these rules and regulations means you don't have the luxury necessarily of time. So how do you balance speed and agility with compliance? And that's sort of one of the yin and yang of this whole software development DevOps movement in finance. You have to balance both. And so SpiraTeam makes this easier for you because we do let you have a completely agile workflow in the system where you can manage requirements, you can have user stories, we've got product backlogs as you can see here, we've got some requirements, we've got some defects all in the backlog, and basically you have this agile view for managing the project, but if you look closely, you do have test cases and tasks still linked to the requirements. So you have that traceability. It's just in an agile form. So you can be agile, you can have sprints, you can have fast releases, you can have DevOps, you can have continuous integration, but you still have the provenance of all the information that there was behind that. You can still generate your compliance reports, you can still make sure you have test coverage. So with SpiraTeam, you don't have to sacrifice agility for compliance, you can have both. An important part of that is also security. Whatever tool you decide to use, obviously this is about SpiraTeam, but any tool you use, make sure you have sufficient permissions, because going back to that audit trail, an audit trail and a workflow is only going to be valid if you know who made the changes and who's allowed to make the changes. So having a configurable and appropriate set of workflows for your projects that match your policies is really important. So from SpiraTeam, we would definitely say you have to make sure that you align your security and permissions with your policies. If you have a document that describes how you develop software, how you release it, your systems have to be configured to match that. There's no point having a set of policies on paper that don't bear life in real life. You need to have systems that you're using to manage and develop your systems connect directly to the policies. So that's an overview of the SpiraTeam side of things. We'll get a little bit more into it in the application demos. There's also automated testing. So back to that concept of compliance and agility. So as you have increasingly faster release times and cycle times, how do you release faster? How do you release on schedule? How do you make sure that your users aren't waiting for functionality? But also, how do you make sure what they get is high quality and is compliant? Well, one of the things you can do is automate some of your testing. So what you can do is find out what are the repeatable things that we're doing, which are taking a long time, that need to be automated. So we can do that very easily using an automation tool. And Rapise, which is our automation tool, which you can see here, it's a scriptless, test-driven, keyword-driven, data-driven automation tool, which lets you automate different kinds of applications. It could be your online banking application. It could be a mobile banking application. It could be some of your back-office apps. The more you can automate, the faster you can release. Also, what automation does is it relieves your testing team from repeatedly going through the same scripts by hand, which is laborious, and instead you still need humans to test things, but they can focus on the edge cases. They can focus on some of the unusual cases which potentially they wouldn't have had time for. So if we think back to our horror story, imagine that you're doing automated testing of that banking application, the TSB one, for example. Well, you could do automated testing to make sure a user logs in, they can see their account, they can do all these things. You can test thousands of different accounts at once. You can make sure it's going to handle that, different data types. Meanwhile, when you're doing that in parallel, humans could go in and actually try out logging in as a human, and they may notice that I can see someone else's account, and that's not something you may have tested for. So the problem is you're not testing for that, so your automated test wouldn't find it, and if you're doing manual testing, because that's all you have, probably in the rush to get ready for release, your human testers are going to be focusing on the testing, the positive case. What is it that I'm looking for? Does it work? As opposed to, well, it does everything it's supposed to, but it also shows a whole bunch of things it shouldn't. And so if you give your manual testers more time to do exploratory testing, freeform testing, edge case analysis, they will find the things that you haven't thought of, but if they happen in real life, are going to hit the front page of the papers the next day. And use automation to remove all the rote, the boring, the mindless stuff that testers will typically do otherwise, and free them up for that. So using automation and using it appropriately is really important. And specifically, using an automation tool that lets you do data-driven testing is really important as well, because that's what will let you test large volumes of data, lots of combinations, especially for those rote test cases. If you're doing a lot of mathematical testing, having a tool like Rapise where you can use spreadsheets to do a lot of the data, you can do calculations, you can test that there isn't a rounding error. I mean, potentially a rounding error of X decimal places could be catastrophic for a bank. And so things like that are harder for a human to test because we might see one decimal place and misread it. A computer is going to be very precise. So when you're dealing with a lot of numerical financial transactions, automated testing gives you that precision you need as well. And then one other thing we would talk about is data interoperability. Banks tend to have lots of complex systems, and the same is true for the testing tools. So when you're looking at tools to help you do your testing and do your management of testing and automation, the data that's in, for example, SpiraTeam is of more use than just simply for the test team. It's also your audit documents. And so some of our customers are actually using our APIs to actually pull the data out of SpiraTeam, the requirements traceability, the requirements coverage, pulling those metrics out of SpiraTeam, and basically using that to generate reports and using that to be used in other management systems beyond the testing team, beyond the project team. And so whatever tool you choose, if it's SpiraTeam or another tool, make sure that it has robust APIs for interoperability, because that data that's in there is priceless. It's the lifeblood of your organization, and that's going to be very useful for other management reports, potentially audit reports, and some of that could be in the system when used beyond just the team. So the next thing we're going to do is a live application demo, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A. So let me just exit out of PowerPoint. Move into the live application. So we've talked a little about SpiraTeam. This is the live application right here. And so let's say you're using it for the first time. In the demo, we're going to set up a few test cases and a few requirements just to give you a feel of the system. We won't have time to use the whole system in the time remaining. So what we'll do is we've created a finance project, which is for our demo today. And when you first go into SpiraTeam, you go to the requirements section. That's where you would build out your requirements. And as I mentioned before, you might decide that you're going to start with the system requirements and functional requirements, but then what you're going to want to often do is pull in the policies, pull in the regulations, pull in the requirements from other parts of the company that are going to be used. So for right now, we're going to create a mobile banking app. So you will call it the mobile banking app required features. So these are what we want this banking app to do. We'll create one, and we're going to click into it. And what we'll do is we'll just go and create another one. So let's create another requirement. So under this, we're going to have under the mobile banking app, we're going to have a requirement to, users can see their balances and not other users. That would be good. And once they've done that, what they're going to want to do, let's think. They're going to want to, users can make wire transfers. And maybe we'll add in here more detail, like, for example, ACH for domestic and chips for international. So we want to support both domestic and international wire transfers. Now, you could decide that it makes sense to make those two separate requirements, a separate requirement. The better reason for doing that would be if you want to have separate test cases and separate test coverage, then you want to make them separate requirements. If there's one test case that covers both, then using a single requirement with just some documentation is acceptable, but that's up to you. And then the last requirement will be, users, transfers can make check deposits, which is a handy feature. Okay, so we've written 3 requirements, and I've written some descriptions for some of them. If I go back to my requirements list, you'll see they're right here. And what I want to do is just go in here and indent those under the parent requirement, because those are sub-requirements. So I've got 3 requirements, and if you notice, they're all marked as not covered in the blue. It means there's no test cases. So a shortcut would be, I don't have test cases for this system because it's a brand new repository. Let's go in here and just create test cases for each one. To ensure we have test coverage. So we'll create test cases. That creates one test case for each. In real life, you may have test cases already from Excel or Word, and you would want to integrate those, but that's okay. So we'll go back to test cases right here, and we see we have now 3 test cases. And I'm going to create a new folder called, functional test cases. Hit add. And I want to move those into my folder, so I'm just going to select these 3 and drag them in. And the names are a little bit weird, so I'm going to rename them just to make them a bit cleaner looking. So we're going to have, what's that, users can make deposits. So test that we can make deposits. Test that we can do wire transfers. Test that we can view balances. So we've got 3 test cases. One thing we might want to do is the wire transfer. I think we want to have a separate one for domestic. So we'll just make another one just to show you can have one-to-many. Test that we can do ACH transfers, which is the domestic clearinghouse, which is different from wires. Okay, we've got 4 test cases. And if we go back to our requirements, and let's go into that wire transfer one, we'll rename that to be can make online payments, because ACH for domestic, ships for international. Okay, so we've now can do wires. So we're making it more general, and we're going to go into the test coverage, and we'll add the test case for ACH. So we now have 2 tests. So unlike the other requirements, which only have 1, we now have 2 test cases that both have to pass for this to be tested. And if you go into the history, you'll notice we have an audit trail. So as I mentioned before, we have changed this requirement. We've gone from making it only wire transfers, now we have to handle all online payments. And it's changed by me on this date. So if you have to go back to a regulator and say, why are you supporting online payments in your mobile app? You said you're only going to do wire transfers. Who made that change? You've got that covered. Okay, that's very good. So if we go back to our requirements list, we can also prioritize them. So I'll just put them back into edit mode, and we're going to prioritize them. So we'll say that the balance is pretty high, check deposits is pretty high, maybe online payments not quite so important in the first version. So we can make that medium. That's up to you. And once we've done that, we can then go and we can now build out the test cases. But what we also might want to do, just quickly, track the versions, because we want to know what version was something run in, because that's really important. Because if something fails in one release and we release a new version, well, we want to make sure that we know we've also retested it for the next version. And that's a problem, because sometimes people will assume that because the test passed in the last version, they will always run on this version, and that's not true at all. So having a good understanding of regression and what's changed is really important. So we would always recommend creating a good set of releases, and even under releases you can have sub-releases, you can have patches, you could track sprints or iterations or phases. Having a good set of data around what version it was tested in is really important. So when you push an update and it fails, and there's blowback, oh, okay, we only tested in the version before, that's our mistake. And if things do happen, you can do an analysis, a root cause analysis, to improve for the next time. So lessons learned, it's important to be able to see what was done when to improve your process. Okay, so we've got our requirements. There's test coverage shows nothing's been tested, which is not good. We'll go into test cases. And if you look at the test cases, we've actually got a step in them. When SpiraTeam creates one by default, it actually creates a simple single step. So that makes it easy to run them. The one that I created separately, the wire transfer one, that doesn't have any steps right now. I can go in here and add a step for that one. And this was to test that we can do wire transfers. So, user clicks button to make transfer. Expected result is the transfer screen is displayed. Save and new, and they enter in the routing number, account number, and click submit or something. So you can use this for tracking that. The other thing you might want to do is have some sample data, parameterizing it. This is useful if you want to run the same test case with thousands of different combinations of data. Back to that earlier statement around data-driven testing, you may need to make the same test across different account types. So in which case, just parameterize your test case and just create a test called, maybe it's like amount. Maybe you have another parameter called, routing number or something like that. So you can make your test reusable with different options, and then you can just put that in here and do insert, and there you go. Account is that, or it's amount, sorry, not account, amount, and you can do routing. So you've written a test case that describes what you're testing. Hit save. So now we've got some tests. And once you've got your tests, we've only written a couple, but in real life you'd obviously have a huge set of test coverage. You can now test your requirements. So what you will do, go into test sets, create a new one, testing, release 1 of app. You go into your test set, and we'll add our test cases to it. Go here, add our functional test cases, and we're going to test that we can do ACH, test that we can do wire, test that we can, that's good for now, I think. Hit save. We could obviously test all the features as well. And then once you've got that ready, you then assign it to your tester. Tester is going to go through and run the test case. And this will be an example here of running a test. So let's say the first step passes, which is to bring up the screen. We put in the routing number and the payment number, and let's say, got a routing number validation error. Maybe it doesn't accept the routing number by mistake. We'll put in a print screen of a screenshot, so there's evidence of what happened. Again, evidence is really important when something fails. Go to the incident, and then put in here, validation error on routing number. Okay, and hit fail. So we've now logged a defect, and that's tied back to our test case. Go back to here, test we can do transfers. Let's just pretend that pass works fine, for example, like that. Hit pass. So we've now tested our payment system. Obviously, in real life, back to those examples at the beginning, that is not a sufficient test. We would need to test it with lots of different types of data, different amount sizes, do a lot of negative testing. But the important thing is that when you build your test plan this way and you go back to your requirements, you can see what you've tested. You can see exactly which cases. And so the fact that one of ours has passed and one has failed means that we can look at this and understand, okay, online payments, where are we with that? Oh, I see. The wire transfers failed, ACH transfers passed, and it's very easy to see the impact of that. And you can even go back and say, okay, well, let's make a decision. We've got to go live next weekend. If you imagine that these other two, the balances and the check deposits, were both green, those are high priority. We could pull the online payments functionality out of the app. We could make the link hidden. We could go live. We could go live with the other two if these are both green, and decide that we're going to hold off on that. So it lets the business users make decisions based on where you truly are at. The system will tell you, what's working, what's reliable, where are the issues, and then management can make decisions about what is the risk we accept about going live. So again, SpiraTeam won't make decisions for you, but it helps you make good decisions. And that's some of the functionality that SpiraTeam will help with that. Now, one thing it can do also is if you wanted to tie back to some of the policies, let's say we wanted to track some of the Sarbanes-Oxley policies or some of the other requirements. That's also very doable as well. To do that, you could create another project. So we'll add another project, and we're going to call this one, banking policies. So that way we have a central project with all of our banking policies in one place. We don't have to have them in every project. Okay, so we'll create that. And wait for that to create. Once that's done, what I'm going to do is choose that project, which is banking policies. And I'm going to go into the product associations, and I'm going to authorize this project to share with my finance project, the online banking app. I'm going to share requirements and test cases, for example. So it's from a security standpoint, by default, every project is isolated because the permissions of the system prevent unauthorized people from seeing things they shouldn't. But you, as the owner of your project, have the option to push requirements and test cases, for example, to other projects. So in this banking policies project, I'm just going to create one or two requirements. But imagine there was a requirement for audit logs must be kept for X days. So let's say there's a rule in the banking sector. You have to keep your audit of all the transactions for X days, whatever that is. Maybe another rule must be, transfers need to be authorized by 2 signers. So maybe that's another rule. So these could be some rules that you have to have by law or by policy, whatever it is that makes sense for each of the clients. And then you've got these policies in your central project. Now if you go back to my original project, which was the finance project, if I go back to my list page, you'll see that I have a new option here which you didn't see before: current project, all projects. So by default, I'm going to see the requirements from my core project. For my current project rather, if I add on all, I will see my policies. So I now have one view of all my policies and all my system requirements. That's great. The other thing I could do is I could even link my test cases, if I want to those requirements. So I can test a policy in my project. So I can go into my requirements coverage and say, this test case, test we can view balances. I want to make sure that I'm meeting the policy requirement. The logs must be kept, for example, like that. So now you've got the ability to have a test case in my project link back to that policy. And if I go back to my requirements page, where's it gone? Planning requirements, there you go. You'll see we now have that too. So you can actually test the requirements in one project from another. And then lastly, defects will get tracked in the system as well. And so it's really important to be able to have the traceability of the defects. So we had a validation error on our routing number. What does that impact? Well, we go into the associations tab and we'll see, oh wow, that impacts this test run, which is the run. This is the defect. This is the requirement it impacted. So I can go through here and see all of the requirements that this defect impacted. And from a requirements impact analysis standpoint, if I go back to my finance project right here, and if I go to the dashboard, one of the reports we have is the requirement incident count, which is right here. And you can see each of your requirements and the number of open defects. And this obviously is only a small project with one requirement that we've got an issue with right now. If I chose one of our sample projects that has a lot more data in it, and you go to that exact same widget, you'll see we have a lot more information. You change the view to the general view. You'll see we have a lot more information, and if this was a real project and you saw this, you'd go, wow, that top requirement, ability to add things to the system, it's got a ton of open defects, more than these other ones. Maybe we should look at that. And if that's a high priority requirement that's about to go live, you now need to consider your live date, because there's a whole bunch of defects that have been opened and closed on that, which will be a real issue. And as I mentioned before, the requirements coverage gives you other things like source code. So if you look in here and you see a whole bunch of source code changes, a whole bunch of defects, you may need to reassess whether you're ready to go live, because even if it works today, if it was only fixed yesterday and the code's changing, maybe the risk is too high. And that's where SpiraTeam will help. So we've got about 10 minutes left of our scheduled webinar time. So with that, I'd like to open up to the Q&A. Thanks for watching today's webinar. I hope it was helpful. If you'd like to learn more about software testing, project management, being agile, and compliance challenges in various industries, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Have a great day.